Lone mountain man finds single mom being beaten by her father. What he did shocked everyone. He was her father, and every crack of the hickory switch was punishment for an unforgivable sin, bringing twin daughters into the world without a husband's name. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. The sun bled across the Rockies of Colorado, painting the ancient granite in shades of copper and amber. Here, in the heart of a land that was all jagged peaks and silent endurance, a man moved, as if he were born from the stone itself. To the few trappers who knew of him, he was called Gideon Reed, he who walks the high ridges, and his existence was a quiet conversation with the pine and the wind. His eyes, accustomed to the vast, unforgiving beauty of his domain, missed nothing, not the shadow of an eagle circling high above, nor the flicker of a pine marten on a frost-split log. The silence of the mountains was a language he understood, a symphony of subtle sounds that spoke of life and survival. But on this day, a new sound intruded, a sharp, ugly tear in the fabric of the mountain's peace. It was a sound that did not belong, the wet, sharp crack of seasoned hickory striking flesh, followed by a sob so raw it seemed to wound the air itself. The sound pulled him from the ridgetop, guiding him down a winding, treacherous path with a certainty that was instinctual. He moved without sound, a living shadow flowing over the rock until he saw its source. Near a ramshackle cabin, a place that reeked of neglect and misery, a woman was crumpled in the dirt. Her name was Catherine Hartwell, and the ghost of recent childbirth still clung to her, a fragility that made the scene all the more profane. Above her stood her father, Josiah Brennan, his face a mask of righteous fury, the switch in his hand rising and falling with a grim rhythm. He was not a man punishing a child. He was a zealot cleansing a stain. His words were venom spat between the blows. He spoke of shame, of an impurity brought into his house, a curse delivered in duplicate. From a crude pine crate nearby, the thin, reedy cries of newborns answered him, the sound of the very crime for which their mother was being brutalized. Two infant girls, their hair as pale as wheat, were the source of his rage. Satisfied that his lesson had been delivered, Josiah Brennan coiled his switch, his breathing heavy but even, as if he had merely been splitting firewood. He cast one last look of disgust at the woman on the ground and the crate of wailing infants, then turned and walked away, his back straight, leaving her broken in the unforgiving cold. Gideon remained motionless, hidden by the deep shadows of a boulder outcrop, his face as unreadable as the mountain walls. He waited, his patience a thing learned from the peaks themselves, until the man's silhouette was swallowed by the tree line. Only then did he emerge. He did not rush forward. His steps were measured, deliberate, the soft fall of his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He was not a savior riding in on a white horse. He was a force of nature, an answer to the violence that had just transpired, his presence a silent, profound question in the sudden ringing quiet. He stood over her, his form eclipsing the brutal afternoon sun. Catherine flinched, curling into herself, every muscle tensed for another blow. Her mind, clouded by pain and exhaustion, could only register the shape of a man, and a man was a harbinger of pain. But the blow never came. Instead, a water flask, old and worn smooth, was placed gently on the ground beside her. He made no sound, merely retreated a few steps, giving her space, his silence an invitation. Thirst, a desperate, clawing thing, eventually won out over fear. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her eyes never leaving his. He remained still, a figure carved from the very rock of the mountain, his gaze not upon her, but upon the horizon, affording her a sliver of dignity. After she drank, his gaze shifted to the crate where Margaret and Eleanor's cries had weakened to exhausted whimpers. With a slow, deliberate movement he approached it, his hands, which could have snapped a man's neck, reaching for the rough-hewn wood with a tenderness that defied belief. He lifted the crate, as if it contained the most fragile of treasures. Then he turned back to her and offered his hand. Terror warred with a desperate, burgeoning hope. She had never known a man's touch that did not seek to control or to harm. Hesitantly, she placed her bruised fingers in his palm. His grip was firm, a steady anchor, and he pulled her to her feet with an economy of effort that spoke of immense strength. Yet he was careful not to aggravate her injuries. The journey was a blur of sun-scorched rock and bristling spruce. He led her away from the cabin, deeper into the labyrinth of peaks, where the trails vanished to all but the most knowing eyes. She stumbled often, her body a vessel of agony, but each time his arm was there to steady her, his presence a silent wall between her and the unforgiving terrain. He carried the crate with the infants in one arm, never jostling them, his movements fluid and certain. They arrived at a place that felt like a secret held by the earth itself, a cave carved deep into the granite by millennia of ice and water, was hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel. Inside, the air was cool and still. It was a wound in the rock, a place of healing. He laid the babies down on a bed of soft pine needles and turned his attention to her. He gathered water from a spring deep within the cave, washing the blood and dust from her cuts, with strips of clean buckskin he produced from a leather pouch. His touch was methodical, impersonal, yet profoundly kind. He moved through the mountain landscape, gathering leaves and roots she did not recognize, crushing them between two stones to create a dark, fragrant paste. The sting, as he applied it to the open wounds on her back and arms, was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a pain that promised to mend rather than break. The first day bled into the first night. The pressing issue became the cries of her daughters. They were hungry, their small bodies demanding what she in her weakened state could barely provide. As dusk settled, Gideon slipped out of the cave and vanished into the blue twilight. A fresh wave of panic seized Catherine. He had saved her only to abandon her to a slower, more agonizing fate. She clutched her daughters, her heart a cold stone in her chest. But just before the moon crested the mountain rim, he returned. He was not alone. He led by a loosely tied rope of woven willow bark a cream-colored dairy goat, its eyes wide and wild. He had not hunted. He had understood their true need. He cornered the animal in a small recess, speaking to it in low, soothing tones, his hands moving with a hypnotist's calm until, impossibly, the creature allowed him to milk it into a small tin cup. He warmed the milk over a smokeless fire he built with practiced ease, tested its warmth against his wrist, and then passed the cup to her. This became their ritual. Each dawn and each dusk, he would disappear and return with the goat, providing for her children with a patience she had never witnessed. Days melted into a week. He never spoke to her, but his actions were a language all their own. He carved tiny, intricate figures for the girls from scraps of aspen wood, a wolf, a hawk, a bear. He would find patches of sunlight at the cave's mouth and place them there to sleep in the warmth. And every night, as she and her daughters slept inside the protective darkness of the cave, he would sit at the entrance, a silent silhouette against the star-dusted sky, his vigil a promise more powerful than any words. Catherine watched him, this strange, quiet man. She had been taught that his kind were savages, but the only savagery she had ever known had come from her own blood. This man's hands were calloused and scarred, yet they had never once been raised in anger. They had mended her wounds, fed her children, and kept watch over her. The terror that had lived in her soul for so long began to loosen its grip, its sharp edges smoothed by the steady, silent rhythm of his care. In its place, something bewildering and fragile began to grow, a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. The moon cycled from a silver sliver to a round, knowing eye and back again. The gashes on Catherine's back faded into a lattice-work of pale scars, a permanent map of her past. Her body, once frail and trembling, grew stronger with each sunrise, nourished by the venison and grouse Gideon provided, and the quiet, uninterrupted peace of their sanctuary. The twins, Margaret and Eleanor, thrived. Their cries were no longer thin and greedy, but full of vigor, their eyes bright with a curiosity that had never been dimmed by cruelty. A silent, gentle rhythm governed their days. Gideon would hunt and stand watch. Catherine would care for the children and maintain their simple home in the rock, and the dairy goat would appear at the edges of twilight, a faithful, miraculous provider. But the modern world, with its needs and its artifice, could not be held at bay forever. The last of the salt was gone. The swaddling cloth she had fled with were worn to threads, and she longed for a sliver of soap, a simple comfort that felt like an impossible luxury. She knew she could not ask her silent protector for these things. They were not of his world. The decision hardened within her. She would go to Silverton. She owed it to her daughters and to herself to not be entirely dependent on his charity. She explained it to him one morning, her voice hesitant from disuse, the words punctuated by gestures toward the worn blankets and the empty salt pouch. He listened, his grey eyes watching her face, his expression unchanging. He did not argue or question. He simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement of respect for her will. Before she left, he pressed something into her hand, a small, perfectly cured beaver pelt, its fur impossibly soft. It was a gift of immense value, a way for her to trade without begging. The journey to the town of Silverton felt different this time. The sun was still cold, the landscape still formidable, but her fear had been replaced by a quiet competence. She knew the taste of the water from the spring, the shade of the pine trees, the path of the sun. The mountains were no longer a place of desolation, but a landscape she was beginning to understand. Silverton, however, was a world built of straight lines and sharp corners. The neat timber houses, the stark white steeple of the church, the muddy main street. It all felt alien, a place of rigid order after the fluid, organic chaos of the peaks. Eyes watched her from behind lace curtains. Women stopped their conversations as she passed, their whispers following her like a chill wind. She felt the familiar cloak of shame settle back onto her shoulders. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, leather, and lye soap. The storekeeper was a man with a pinched face and weary eyes, who looked at her as if she were a stray dog that had wandered in from the cold. His politeness was a thin, brittle veneer over his disapproval. She was laying the beaver pelt on the counter when the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of Abigail Preston and her companions. Abigail was the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was her sharpest weapon. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, swept over Catherine, taking in her patched dress, her sun-darkened skin, and the undeniable fact that she was alone. "Catherine Hartwell," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "We had all heard such terrible rumors. To see you here, it is a relief." The women with her murmured in agreement. "But where is your father? And you have children now, I hear. Twins?" The question was a scalpel disguised as innocent curiosity. The store fell silent. The storekeeper pretended to be busy organizing tins on a shelf. In that moment, Catherine was no longer the woman who had survived in the mountains. She was once again Josiah Brennan's shamed daughter, a fallen woman on display. The pity in their eyes was more scalding than her father's rage. It was a judgment that condemned her not for any sin, but for the very fact of her existence, for daring to live and bring new life into the world without the sanction of a husband and a church. She could not breathe. The walls of the store seemed to close in, the weight of their righteousness a physical force. Leaving the salt and the cloth on the counter, she turned and fled, the beaver pelt forgotten. She didn't stop running until the last rigid line of Silverton had dissolved into the hazy distance. The journey back was a desperate flight towards safety. With every step that took her deeper into the peaks, she felt the suffocating grip of their judgment loosen. When she finally saw the familiar curtain of laurel that hid their cave, a sob of profound relief escaped her. The mountains did not judge. The rocks did not whisper. The wind did not care who her children's father was. It was a raw, wild, and dangerous place, but it was honest. She had gone to town seeking the comforts of civilization, but she found only a prison of whispers and scorn. She returned to the mountain with the unshakable knowledge that her world had been turned inside out. The desolate wilderness was her sanctuary, her only true home, and the silent, watchful man who lived within it was the only soul who had ever looked at her and seen not a sinner, but a survivor. The quiet rhythm of their life, so hard-won and fragile, was broken not by a man, but by the sky itself. It began subtly, a change in the quality of the light, a brassy, ominous sheen that coated the rocks. The air grew heavy and still, the usual hum of insects falling silent, as if the mountain were holding its breath. Gideon, who had been dressing an elk, suddenly stopped, his head lifting to read the signs Catherine couldn't see. His movements became economical and swift. He gestured for her to gather the children and their few belongings, his urgency a silent alarm bell. He led them deeper into the cave, into a narrow fissure at the back she had never explored. It opened into a smaller, higher chamber, a pocket of safety in the heart of the granite. No sooner had they settled into the close darkness than the world outside exploded. The wind came first, a physical wall of ice and grit that screamed through the peaks. Then came the rain. It was not a cleansing shower, but a biblical deluge, a solid sheet of water that struck the earth with the force of 1,000 hammers. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar as a wall of brown, churning water, thick with debris, surged through the valley floor, scouring the very place they had called home. In the suffocating dark of the upper chamber, Catherine's own fear was a roaring flood, but the terrified cries of Margaret and Eleanor anchored her. While Gideon braced his body against a cluster of loose rocks near the entrance to their cramped haven, she focused on her daughters, humming a tuneless lullaby, shielding their bodies with her own, her voice a tiny, defiant thread of calm against the storm's violent symphony. This was her trial, her battle to fight, and she would not fail. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a world remade and utterly devastated. The familiar landscape was gone, replaced by a treacherous terrain of slick mud and freshly exposed, sharp-edged rock. The curtain of laurel that had hidden their home was torn away, leaving them exposed. But the most devastating loss was discovered at dawn. The dairy goat was gone. Gideon found the tracks at the edge of the floodline, unmistakable even in the mud, the heavy paw prints of a grizzly bear and the frantic, scattered hoof prints of its prey. There was no struggle, only the story of a swift, silent end. The living miracle that had sustained her children had vanished. A cold, sharp despair, the likes of which she hadn't felt since her father's last blow, pierced through Catherine. The easy magic was gone, replaced by the hard, unforgiving reality of survival. The baby's hungry wails were a constant, painful reminder of their new precarity. Gideon's focus shifted. He now spent his days tracking, his hunts longer and more arduous, returning with smaller game, not enough to provide the rich milk the infants needed. He worked tirelessly to create a thin, nourishing broth for them, a desperate stopgap against starvation. Watching him, seeing the lines of exhaustion deepen around his eyes, Catherine knew she could no longer be a passive ward. She had to contribute. She began to walk the scoured valley, her eyes searching the ground, not in fear but with purpose. She looked for the plants she had seen him gather, her mind replaying his movements. She found the tough, starchy, wild onion bulbs he had once dug and roasted. She identified the tart, hardy service berries that grew in the shelter of the rocks. Her offerings were meager at first, a handful of roots, a few berries, but they were something. It was food she could eat to keep up her own strength, to ensure she could continue to care for her daughters. One evening, Gideon returned late, empty-handed and weary, the weight of their situation heavy on his shoulders. He saw her by the fire, nursing the twins with the last of the broth. Beside her was a small, neat pile of roots she had dug and cleaned. He stopped, his eyes lingering on her small contribution. He looked from the roots to her face, and for the first time she saw something other than watchful patience in his expression. It was a flicker of respect, a recognition of a spirit that refused to be broken. He gave a single, slow nod. In that silent gesture, everything shifted. They were no longer the rescuer and the rescued. They were partners in a shared, desperate struggle. The mountain was still a dangerous, unforgiving place, but she was no longer a stranger within it. She was learning its language of survival, and in doing so, she was discovering a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience forged not in spite of the harshness around her, but because of it. The hardship of their new reality settled into a grueling routine. The search for food was a constant, desperate calculus of energy spent versus calories gained, but they were alive. They had survived the storm and its aftermath, and in the shared struggle, a silent partnership had been forged. Catherine no longer felt like a guest in the mountains. She was a part of its harsh, demanding ecosystem, but the wilderness held trials far more cruel than floods or predators. It started with a cough, a dry, rasping sound from Margaret's tiny chest. At first, Catherine dismissed it, but the cough deepened and a fever set in, a malevolent heat that radiated from the child's small body. Catherine did what she could, bathing her forehead with cool water from the spring, but the fever raged unabated, climbing with the merciless sun. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her hard-won composure. Gideon returned from a day-long hunt to find her cradling the sick child, her face a mask of fear. He knelt, his usual stoicism giving way to a profound gravity as he placed a hand on Margaret's brow. He listened to her breathing, his eyes closing as if deciphering a faint, terrible message on the air. He looked at Catherine, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of the same fear she felt reflected in his eyes. He rose and pointed toward the highest, most treacherous peaks that clawed at the northern sky, their distant ridges shrouded in mist. He spoke a single word, his voice low and rough: Columbine. Then he made a gesture with his hands, mimicking a flower opening its petals to the stars. The cure was there, but it was a 3-day journey through territory where grizzlies ruled, and a single misstep meant a fall of 1,500 feet. He did not ask for her permission. He simply prepared, gathering a small amount of dried meat, his water flask, and a length of sturdy rope. His gaze met hers before he left, and in that look, a silent promise was made. He would not fail. And then he was gone, a fleeting shadow swallowed by the vastness of the landscape, leaving her utterly alone with her 2 daughters, one of whom was burning with a fire that threatened to consume her. The vigil was the longest journey of Catherine's life. The mountain, once her sanctuary, became a silent, indifferent witness to her agony. The sun rose and set, marking time she measured in the shallow, ragged breaths of her child. She fought the fever with relentless desperation, her hands never still, her voice a constant low hum of prayer and lullabies. She spoke to Margaret, telling her stories of the brave wolf Gideon had carved for her, of the hawk that soared on the wind, begging her to fight to hold on. She cared for Eleanor with a mechanical tenderness, her heart splintered, terrified that she would lose one child while trying to save the other. She did not sleep. She did not stop. She was a mother fighting death with the only weapons she had, her will and a love so fierce it was a physical pain in her chest. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the shadows grew long and a sliver of hope had begun to die within her, he returned. He stumbled into the clearing, his clothes torn, his face etched with a pain and exhaustion so deep it seemed to have aged him. A crude bandage was wrapped around his forearm, stained dark with blood. But in his other hand, he clutched a small handful of pale blue columbine flowers with delicate petals. He collapsed to his knees, his energy spent, and began crushing the blossoms between 2 stones without a word. Catherine was by his side instantly, helping him mix the fragrant pulp with a few precious drops of water. Together they gently coaxed the medicine past Margaret's lips. Then, all they could do was wait. They sat side by side through the long cold night, the silent fire casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. There was no need for words. Their shared fear, their shared hope, was a living presence between them. As they tended to the child, their hands brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of profound connection through Catherine. This man, a stranger from a different world, was bound to her now by the most sacred of threads, the life of her child. Just before dawn, when the sky was a soft, bruised purple, something shifted. The rasping in Margaret's chest softened. The violent heat radiating from her skin began to subside. She stirred, and her breathing, for the first time in 3 days, was deep and even. The fever had broken. A sob, born of sheer, soul-shattering relief, broke from Catherine. She looked at Gideon in the growing light. She saw the wound he had taken for her, the brutal cost of his journey written on his face. He had not saved her from a beating this time. He had journeyed to the roof of the world to pull her daughter back from the brink of death. The gratitude she felt was a tidal wave, so powerful it washed away the last remnants of her old life, of her fear. In its place, something new and terrifyingly beautiful began to take root. It was the hope of a future she had never dared to imagine. In the weeks that followed Margaret's recovery, a gentle quiet settled back into the mountain, but it was a different kind of silence. The old silence had been one of caution and uncertainty. This new quiet was softer, woven through with the threads of shared relief and a deep, unspoken understanding. The barrier between them, once as formidable as the mountain walls, had been worn down to almost nothing. It was Gideon who crossed it first. He was showing her a plant with broad silvery leaves, demonstrating how its roots could be ground into a soothing paste for burns. "Arnica," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse. Catherine looked up, surprised. She repeated the word, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth as he corrected her pronunciation. That single word was a key, unlocking a door she hadn't known existed. Soon she began to ask for the names of things: spruce for the towering trees, columbine for the healing flower, twilight for the shadows that danced on the rocks at dusk. He would answer in his quiet way, and a new language began to form between them, one made of his words and her melodies, of shared tasks and comfortable silences. One afternoon, she insisted on tending to the gash on his forearm. The wound was healing cleanly, but the bandage was crude. He sat still as a statue and allowed her to wash it, his muscles tense beneath her touch. Her fingers were gentle, her movements full of reverence and gratitude that went far beyond the simple act of nursing a wound. As she worked, she felt the rigid wall of his solitude, the immense self-reliance he carried like a second skin, permit her entry. In that moment, she was not just mending his flesh. She was acknowledging the sacrifice he had made, a debt she could never repay but would honor for the rest of her life. Their lives became more deeply intertwined. He taught her how to predict the weather by the scent of the air and the shape of the clouds. She showed him how to weave the tough fibers of willow bark into soft, durable cordage. He would return from a hunt to find the fire burning brightly and a simple meal of roasted roots waiting. She would wake in the night to the soft sound of him mending one of her daughter's moccasins, his large hands impossibly deft with the small needle and sinew. She watched her daughters grow, their laughter echoing off the warm granite. They were unafraid, their world defined not by a cruel father and a judgmental town, but by the vast open sky and the unwavering presence of their protector. A joy so pure it felt like a betrayal of her past began to bloom in Catherine's chest. She had come to this mountain as a refugee, broken and shamed, but in its harsh embrace she had found not just safety, but a sense of belonging she had never known. This wilderness was her home. One evening, Gideon stood on the ridge above the cave, watching the firelight cast a warm golden glow from within. He heard Catherine's voice soft and clear as she sang a lullaby to the twins. It was a simple, sweet melody that spoke of green fields and gentle streams, a world away from their reality of rock and ice. Yet the sound was not out of place. It had become part of the mountain's song. He realized that the solitude he had once cultivated as a shield had become a hollow thing. The quiet footsteps, the soft singing, the children's laughter. These sounds had filled a space inside him he hadn't known was empty. He was no longer just a man who walked the ridges alone. He was the guardian of a life, a home. The peace was so complete it felt sacred and therefore fragile. The premonition of its end arrived with the dusk a few days later. Gideon returned from a wide patrol of their territory, his stride unhurried as always, but his eyes were different. They held a new, hard light. The watchfulness had sharpened into a hunter's focus. He did not speak of what he had seen, but his actions spoke for him. That night, he did not rest. He sat by the fire, methodically sharpening the edge of his knife against a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a disquieting sound in the calm night. He restrung his bow, testing its tension again and again. The brief season of peace was over. Something was coming. The world she had fled had remembered her name. The rhythm of the knife on the whetstone was the only sound in the valley for 2 days. It was a sound that scraped away the soft edges of their peace, leaving only a raw nervous tension. Catherine found she couldn't settle, her ears straining to catch any sound that was out of place, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines. The sanctuary had begun to feel like a cage. On the morning of the 3rd day, Gideon led her a half-mile from the cave to a place where the trail crossed a patch of soft, muddy earth. There, etched into the dirt, was the clear, sharp print of a shod horse, and beside it, the deeper impression of a man's boot. It was not the mark of a wandering prospector. The tracks were deliberate, part of a searching, circular pattern. He looked at her, his grey eyes holding hers, and she did not need him to speak. Her father's will was a relentless thing, a poison that had seeped out of Silverton and was now seeping into the cracks of her new life. The world outside had not forgotten her. It was actively hunting her. The days that followed were a blur of tense preparation. The valley was no longer their home. It became their fortress. Gideon worked with a silent, grim purpose, transforming the landscape into an extension of his will. He showed her a new escape route, a treacherous hand-over-hand climb to a narrow ledge hidden high on the cliff face. He piled loose stones near the main approach to their camp, a natural alarm that would announce any intruder. He wove a screen of dried brush and pine branches, concealing the entrance to their cave so perfectly it seemed to vanish into the rock itself. He was not preparing for a battle. He was preparing the terrain to fight for them. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, returned to Catherine, but it was different now. It was not the passive, helpless terror of a victim. It was the fierce, sharp-edged fear of a mother protecting her young. Her daughters' lives were the stakes, and her fear was fuel for a resolve she had never known she possessed. The threat arrived on a windless, freezing afternoon. Gideon was gone, scouting the lower valley. When the scrape of a boot on stone echoed from the trail below, Catherine's heart seized. She snatched up her sleeping daughters, her movement swift and silent, and scrambled back into the dark fissure at the rear of the cave, the very place they had hidden from the flood. She pressed herself into the cold rock, her body a shield over her children, her hand held ready to clap over a mouth at the first hint of a cry. She heard a man's voice, coarse and complaining. Nothing here either. The old man's chasing ghosts. She recognized the voice. It was a hired hand named Dalton, a man who had worked for her father, a man who had often watched her with a cruel amusement in his eyes. Her blood ran cold. He was close, so close she could hear the jingle of his spurs, the creak of his leather gun belt. Eleanor stirred in her arms, her small body arching as she began to wake. A whimper, small but terrifyingly loud in the silence, escaped her lips. Panic, absolute and suffocating, clawed at Catherine. She pressed the baby's face gently into the soft flesh of her shoulder, muffling any sound, and began to hum, a low, desperate vibration that was more a prayer than a melody. She felt the baby relax against her, her own heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. Dalton paused just outside the now invisible entrance to their cave. What was that? He muttered to himself. Catherine held her breath, certain they were discovered. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, with a grunt of disgust, he moved on, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he continued down the valley. She stayed hidden in the darkness long after the sound of his passing had faded, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. When Gideon returned at dusk, he needed only one look at her pale, strained face to know what had happened. The violation was complete. Their secret world was no longer secret. Hiding was a temporary solution, a stay of execution, but not a life. That night, as she watched him stand vigil at the mouth of the cave, she knew a decision had been made. She would not allow her daughters to grow up in a whisper, their lives spent in a dark fissure, always listening for the footsteps of the men who hunted them. She walked to him, the firelight casting their long shadows against the rock. He turned to look at her, and in her eyes he saw not fear but a cold, clear fire. She did not have to speak. He saw the end of her retreat and the beginning of her stand. He gave a single, solemn nod of understanding. The time for hiding was over. The hunter had to be confronted, not for revenge, but for the sake of the future, for the sake of the quiet laughter that now echoed in the valley. He picked up his rifle, its wood smooth and familiar in his hand, his purpose as clear and deadly as the lead bullet in its chamber. He did not allow her to wait in the place where she had built a life. Before the moon had risen, Gideon led them from the cave, their home now nothing more than bait in a trap. Their path was a near vertical climb, a series of handholds and footholds she could never have navigated weeks ago. But now her body moved with a hard-won strength and certainty. He settled them on a high, hidden ledge, a hawk's perch concealed by a gnarled juniper tree, overlooking the clearing below. He gave her a water flask and a simple, direct command conveyed with his eyes. You will stay here, and you will be silent, no matter what comes. Then he melted back into the rocks, leaving her alone with her children and the agonizing weight of anticipation. From her vantage point, the clearing was a stage set for a final, terrible act. Every familiar rock, every patch of snow seemed alien and menacing. The waiting was a silent scream in her soul. She held her daughters close, their warmth a fragile anchor in a sea of fear. The sun was high and brutal when they arrived. Her father, Josiah Brennan, walked into the clearing as if he owned the very stones, his hired hand, Dalton, trailing a few paces behind. Josiah's face was not flushed with anger. It was pale and set with the cold, unshakable certainty of a zealot. He carried his rifle not as a tool for hunting, but as an instrument of judgment. Catherine, his voice was not a plea but a command, the same voice that had haunted her nightmares for a lifetime. Come out and face your redemption. The time for hiding in filth is over. When the answer came, it was not from the cave. Gideon stepped out from the deep shadows of the opposite valley wall, appearing as if he had materialized from the rock itself. He was not between Josiah and the cave, but between Josiah and the trail out, a silent, deadly gatekeeper. His sudden appearance was so jarring that Dalton took a startled step back. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. So, Josiah sneered, a flicker of contempt in his eyes, this is the creature you've chosen. You would trade your soul for a wild man. Gideon remained motionless, his rifle held loosely at his side, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Dalton, Josiah commanded, his attention still fixed on Gideon. Go into that hole and drag her out. Her and the bastards. Dalton hesitated, his eyes darting from his employer to the silent mountain man. But Josiah's will was absolute. With a nervous gulp, Dalton began to circle toward the cave. He took 3 steps before his boot snagged on a thin, nearly invisible cord of sinew stretched taut across the path. Above him, a carefully balanced pile of rocks and timber held in place by a single wedge gave way. The resulting rockslide was not an avalanche. It was precise, controlled, and brutally effective. It swept Dalton off his feet. His cry of alarm cut short as his leg was pinned beneath a tangle of heavy stones, his rifle clattering away, its stock shattered. Josiah stared, his mouth agape at his incapacitated man, then swung his rifle up, aiming it squarely at Gideon's chest. You will pay for that. This land will be cleansed of you. Gideon did not raise his rifle. He simply stood, his feet planted, his gaze locked with Josiah's. And in that gaze, Josiah saw the totality of his miscalculation. He saw a power that did not come from righteousness or rage, but from the earth itself. He saw a spirit as ancient and unforgiving as the mountain, a man who was not merely living in this wilderness, but was an extension of it. He saw the absolute certainty of his own death, not as a possibility, but as a foregone conclusion should he pull the trigger. There would be no fight. There would only be a conclusion. Josiah's civilized fury, the burning conviction that had carried him all this way, withered and died in the face of that primal, unwavering truth. The barrel of the rifle trembled. His knuckles were white. For a moment, his pride warred with the stark animal instinct for survival. Survival won. With a choked sound that was half sob, half curse, he lowered the rifle. "Damn you!" he spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Damn you all to hell!" He turned then, and without a backward glance at the moaning, trapped man he had brought with him, he stumbled back down the trail, a broken man fleeing a battle he had lost before it had even begun. Gideon watched until his shadow was gone. Only then did he move, swiftly and efficiently, to the rock slide. He dislodged the stones pinning Dalton's leg, not with gentleness, but with a detached competence. "Go," he said, his first and only word of the encounter. Dalton, groaning in pain, scrambled to his feet and hobbled away, a living message to the world that this place and this family were protected. A moment later, a calloused hand appeared on the ledge above Catherine. She took it, and he guided her down the cliff face. In the soft light of the new morning, she stood in the clearing, now peaceful again, and looked at the man who had faced the monster of her past and had not yielded. He had not killed him with a bullet, but had defeated him with a strength so profound her father could not even comprehend it. A wave of relief, so total and overwhelming it left her weak, washed through her. The ghost that had hunted her for so long was finally gone, banished not by violence but by the unshakable stillness of a guardian. The past was dead. For the first time, she was truly free. The silence that descended upon the valley in the wake of Josiah's departure was absolute. It was the silence of a fever that is finally broken, leaving the world quiet, clean, and utterly changed. Catherine felt it in her bones, a profound peace that was so complete it was almost disorienting. She was free. The chains of fear and shame that had bound her since birth had been shattered. But as days turned into a week, a new, quieter uncertainty began to surface. Freedom was a vast, open space, and she was standing in the middle of it with her 2 daughters belonging nowhere. She could not return to Silverton. Its judgment was as cruel as her father's hand. But could she stay in this valley forever? Was this solitary existence, however peaceful, the only future for her children? She was a woman without a people, an outcast adrift between 2 worlds, belonging to neither. Gideon watched her, his silent gaze missing none of the subtle shadows that now flickered in her eyes. He saw that he had severed the ties to her past, but he had not yet given her a path to a future. One evening, as the stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky, he sat across the fire from her and began to speak. His voice, steady and low, filled the quiet space between them. He told her of the trappers and hunters who lived scattered through these mountains, men who had turned their backs on civilization's judgments, He spoke of trading posts in hidden valleys where such men gathered, places where a person's past mattered less than their ability to survive. He spoke of friends, other mountain men who lived by a different code. They did not measure a person by the name of their father or the sanction of a church. They measured a soul by its capacity to endure, to protect its own, to find life in the harshest of places. "Your fight is over, Catherine," he said, using her name for the first time. "But your journey is not. I cannot offer you a place in the settled world, but I can offer you a place in mine." He leaned forward, his expression more open and earnest than she had ever seen it. "There's a valley, 4 days north, a trading post where mountain folk gather. Families live there, trappers' wives, widows, children, people who've chosen this life. What you call shame, they call strength. The story of how you protected your children, of how you survived in this valley, that will earn their respect. Your courage will be your place among them." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a gratitude so immense it was painful. He was not just offering her sanctuary, he was offering her an identity, a home. He was taking the pieces of her broken life, the very things for which she had been condemned, and naming them sacred. She looked at her daughters sleeping peacefully, and then at the steady, honorable man before her. Her choice was simple. It was the only choice she had. "Yes," she whispered. The journey was the hardest thing she had ever done. For 4 days they traveled through a formidable wilderness of soaring ridges and plunging ravines, a landscape that demanded every ounce of her newfound strength. But she was not afraid. With Margaret and Eleanor secure in a carrier on her back, and Gideon breaking the trail before her, she felt an unshakable sense of purpose. This was not a flight from the past. It was a pilgrimage toward a future. They arrived at a narrow, hidden pass that opened into a sheltered valley. Inside, the world opened up. It was a small trading post, surrounded by rough cabins, shielded from the outside world by towering peaks, filled with the sounds of life. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played near a creek. A woman hung laundry on a line stretched between 2 pines. Catherine drew her daughters closer, her heart pounding as curious eyes turned toward her. This was no settlement with councils and ceremony. It was a gathering of survivors, people who had chosen the mountains over the judgments of towns. Gideon led her to the trading post, where several mountain men sat on the porch, mending traps and cleaning rifles. An older trapper named Ezra stood as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a cautious but genuine smile. Gideon spoke simply, telling them her story in plain words. He spoke of her father's cruelty, of her flight into the mountains, of the flood and the fever and the grizzly bear. He did not portray her as a victim he had saved, but as a woman who had survived what would have killed most men. When he was finished, Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then at the 2 children she held. A woman emerged from the trading post, her face lined with years of mountain life. She was Sarah, Ezra's wife, and her eyes held the understanding of one who had also fled something. Any woman who can winter in those high valleys with 2 babies and come out standing has earned her place here, Ezra said simply. "We don't ask where folks come from. We ask what they can do." Sarah approached and placed a gentle hand on Catherine's arm. "There's an empty cabin near the creek. Roof needs mending, but it's solid. You're welcome to it. No ceremony, no new name, just acceptance." Her story of resilience is a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that the fiercest love can flourish in the most unforgiving places. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Is it the blood you share or the bonds you forge in the fire of adversity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Catherine flourished in the mountain community. She learned their ways, her hands growing skilled, her heart growing light. Her daughter's laughter, once a fragile, secret sound, now echoed through the valley, their pale hair bright against the rich earth as they played, safe and cherished among the other children. She was no longer a stain to be erased, but a symbol of survival, a woman who had been stripped of everything only to find her true home. The mountain folk came to respect her quiet strength, and she became a valued member of their rugged community. And as she and Gideon stood together watching the sunset, their quiet companionship a bond stronger than any vow, she knew she had found more than a sanctuary. She had found a life. Stories that don't just entertain, but leave a mark. Subscribe, share, and above all, keep believing that true love can still change destiny, because sometimes just one decision suffices to begin again, and this was only the beginning. The next story will surprise you in ways you can't imagine. Click on the video appearing on your screen and get ready to feel even more moved.